We're all good. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm very, very excited to be here, especially forming part of the small Australian contingent. Thank you, Clement, for making up the other 50%. And today, I'm unfortunately here to tell you that we all have something stuck in your teeth. You may not have noticed when you looked in the mirror, but as privacy researchers, there is something that we apparently have just not been seeing for the past 20, 30 years, 50 years. How many years you've been in the field? I don't think we have anyone who's been in the field 70 years. No? Okay. Clicker is not being happy. So firstly, I want to start with the thank yous, particularly to my PhD students who've been involved in this work. And so I'm going to give you a little picture of what we have been doing. I know one or two of you in the audience have seen a little bit of this before, so while we go through it, just bear with me. But now and then we go out into the world, we present our research to people who might actually implement it, whether these be leaders of organizations, whether these be government officials, and we say, read my privacy research, it is totally going to change the way you're doing things. And we typically will do this along with some evidence. We'll present our paper in order to give evidence to the fact that our recommendations actually have some weight. And so you'll see things like this, you'll see news stories that talk about the excellent work we've been doing, thousands of Android apps may be improperly tracking your data, or we'll see this very well-known study on NPC from the Boston Women's Workforce Council to try and determine disparities in gender pay gaps in a privacy-preserving way. And so we do have like some impact out in the world. We feel good about ourselves. We write this in our little end of year reports, whether you're in academia or in industry or in government, you write about the nice things you've done. But there are a lot of papers out there, and not all of them have the same impact. And part of the question is why? What are we doing wrong as a community that we're producing so much privacy research and yet seemingly only having a little impact around the margins? Like one news story is nice, but it doesn't ultimately change the face of facts on the ground. So having been involved in government for a little while, I hear these comments from regulators pretty frequently. This community's work is not actually helping us. In fact, sometimes they're doing more harm than good. So this was anonymous US policy leader number 1, and policy leader number 2, we can't use this. There is something wrong with the research that actually makes it inapplicable to the things that we need the research to be doing if we're actually going to see change in the world. So our goal, and part of the goal of this talk, is to at least get us thinking about a way to make sure that our privacy research impacts policy. And when I say policy here, I mean something a little broader than the way you might naively think of it as like, oh, that means the laws that the US government passes. But policy happens in a lot of different places. It can happen within your organization, for example, if you think about whether you're in a university department and that's your head of school and the provost and all of them setting policy for the way privacy works in that organization, or it's the way that your local government runs the way that they work, or larger organizations or conglomerations. Policy is everywhere and is a lot broader than we traditionally think. So just a tiny bit about me. So I have a background both in law, in government, and in academia, and so that's kind of where I'm trying to bridge these different worlds. And so what my team has been doing over the past couple of months is we've scraped every paper that's been published in the core security and privacy conferences. Depending on your definition of what counts as core security and privacy, we may not actually have covered you, but CCS, Usenix, NDSS, IEEE, S&P, and PETS, we scraped all 5,487 papers from the last decade, and we started to analyze them to figure out, okay, what are they actually doing and what are they saying in terms of policy and in terms of law? And just like a baseline keyword matching, I won't give you all the details, but if you want, you can follow up with me after. 14% of all of them tried to do policy in some way. And this is a number that's actually been increasing over time. So back in 2014, it was only 10%, and now it's getting close to 20% of all papers are trying to do something in policy writ large. So whether that's law or whether they say that organizations should do blah. So what is actually going on behind the scenes? Why is there so much work here and why is it being impactful? So there are a few different reasons why these papers talked about policy, and we categorize them according to the reason why they were attempting to do this. So some people were actually attempting to write a paper that was just inherently policy relevant. So cybercrime, elections, privacy policies, if you write about those topics, because you're writing about the law, obviously that's going to impact. Then there are a bunch of people who are doing it kind of in a cynical fashion. So I needed to make my paper seem impactful, and so I wrote a line about how this is relevant to the law. And that is understandable from one perspective, but is also probably not the most interesting part of these papers. But this first category, I intended to write a paper with policy impact that's related to my deep technical research, but isn't inherently about the law, is probably the area that's of the most interest to us, because that's where people are struggling to kind of bridge this gap. We also further categorized all these papers by annotating them manually about what kind of category they fell into. What area of policy were they trying to impact? And privacy is this big 128 here, and this 20 here is by far and away the largest category of papers that try to have some kind of policy impact. So then we dived in one more level to figure out, okay, how did they actually operationalize this goal? So a bunch of them were interpreting legal requirements, and these are overlapping categories. This slide adds up to more than 100%. So almost all of them tried to interpret some either law or existing regulatory policy, either at the federal level, the state, or the local level. And then they also did a number of other things within the paper in addition to that to try and have impact based on their understanding of that original policy hook. Well, I'll skip this one. There were actually also a few instances where they directly tried to create a tool for regulators to use or to study the public perceptions of how people interacted with a given privacy policy. So this is a lot of talk about what we've been doing. And now, why hasn't this really been working? So there are a few paradigms that are very much dominant when we talk about the definitions of privacy that people are using in these papers. So the first is differential privacy, and I know put your hands up if you're involved in differential privacy work in one way or another. So a very significant fraction of folks here. That's one very common definition that's used in these papers. The next kind of category is cryptographic confidentiality and information leakage. So hands up if you're kind of involved in that area. We've got a few handful of folks there involved in the more kind of cryptographic side of it. Contextual integrity. Anyone here doing contextual integrity? And then people involved in interpreting legal definitions. So hands up if you work with the legal definitions of privacy. So all of these definitions are somewhat disjoint, and they focus on different aspects and understandings of privacy that are somewhat incompatible. And yet, if you actually want to have policy impact, these bridges suddenly become a lot more important, because the people in the organization who care about DP are probably not going to be the compliance folks for the most part. There are a few high-profile examples of where something like a cryptographic or a formal definition has been successfully used, such as the US Census Bureau's attempt to implement differential privacy. But for the most part, we're not seeing these kinds of bridges built between different types of definitions. But ultimately, we need to figure out what is going to have impact. And so to do that, we need to transition away from these kinds of singularly focused types of definitions and work towards finding ways that they can actually be operationalized. So my group's analysis of kind of where we're sitting here really highlights two key aspects that I want to focus on for the remainder of my talk. And this is missing systems thinking with respect to privacy, and missing sophistication with respect to the actors and incentives that actually result in this product and systems that we see deployed. So while it's important to have the kinds of definitions that we have because they impose constraints on our thinking and limit the scope of our problems, ultimately, if we want to have impact in the world, we need to be starting to think about ways to stretch that a little further. So how do we do this? Oh, let me let this person in. How do I do that? There we go. So let me start off with a little bit about bringing systems thinking to privacy. So if we think about how security works, one common way that we conceptualize of security is with a layer model. Now, in the privacy world, we haven't been quite as effective at importing the layer model. And even in security, we often miss layers that might be relevant to understanding how a system functions. So this is, I sort of talked earlier in the week that had the name of the author and then shower thoughts. This is kind of equivalent to that. This is my shower thought of maybe how we should be thinking about the layers involved in privacy in a little more sophisticated a manner. So very often when we see research, it'll either be focused on kind of user studies, which you go and ask a bunch of people, how do you use the system? How do you feel about the system? Or it will be in developing the technical system, So it'll be somewhere down at this layer over here, or it'll be all the way up there in understanding people. But the operationalization of a system, the way systems actually get built, involves everything from the top down to the bottom. In particular, this kind of organizational level is very often neglected. Understanding how an organization thinks about privacy ends up determining what products and what policies actually get put out into the world. So you can replace this middle layer either by your like a local kind of university organization, or you can even think about this as government organizations. And we will let, oh, Adam Smith's being let in. Great. So our current definitional and modeling paradigms don't do a very good job at spanning these kinds of layers. They tend to focus very narrowly on a specific part of the problem, which is what we do as computer scientists or people in related fields. We use this modeling importantly to abstract away parts of the problem that are not amenable easily to formal definitions. But we've been doing this for quite a long time now, and so perhaps the time is now to start trying to figure out how we can expand our definitions a little further so that they incorporate more and more of this overall model. Cryptography has actually done this pretty successfully recently, where we've moved beyond a single, say, a single client and server that need to communicate securely, and now we're starting to have things like provers and verifiers and different roles that individuals in the system can play beyond just sender and recipient. And privacy, to a significant extent, is still trapped in a more unidimensional model, and I'll mention that a little more later. So as long as we're stuck in too simplified a paradigm, we're actually going to have challenges with adoption because people aren't going to be able to see that the model actually fits their situation. It's too far removed, too far abstracted. Okay, let's skip that. One particular interesting piece of work that I want to point people to, this is not my work, but that I think is valuable in exploring kind of how we might start doing this, is this wonderful paper, Bridging the Gap Between Computer Science and Legal Approaches to Privacy, which was an attempt to check if there is a way to formally ensure that a DP mechanism is compliant with FERPA when applied to certain data sources. So please check out this paper if you haven't already. And there's also a slide deck from Alexandra Wood, which has further ideas on that. So that's my pointer to someone else's work, which I think would actually push this conversation significantly further. So here's some challenges in actually doing what I said. So it's all great. Let's fix the problem by making our models better. But if it was so easy, we already would have done it. So some of the open problems and specific challenges that we have in doing this is that legal definitions and the social definitions are open textured. What that means is they use words like reasonable. And what does it mean for a reasonable expectation of privacy? That's not something that's easily formalizable because there is so much, you can keep unpacking it deeper and deeper. So for example, one might say, well, a reasonable expectation of privacy is that your neighbor can't see into your home. But then you can unpack that further and say, well, what about if your home is in a given location? What if your home is exposed, etc.? And those types of like what ifs and extra context are not easy to embed in formal models. Contextual integrity does this somewhat successfully, but at the cost of a lot of the formalization. And the attempts to formalize contextual integrity still have not quite solved this problem. So there's open work there to think about it further. Likewise, systems also have an open textured element. It's unclear what is in the system and what is outside the system. You can always model it at a greater level of detail, and this poses challenges for formal modeling. And the last point here is that often the types of definitions of privacy that leaders of organizations and regulators care about are these more open textured ones that take into account things like not does one bit of information get transferred, not quantifying the leakage, but how does this sit within the risk management, the kinds of risks that I'm comfortable with as an organization. And while I think Rachel has actually done an interesting amount of work by figuring out, okay, how does the value of epsilon correspond to kind of lay definitions or organizational definitions of privacy, this is still a very underexplored area. And so I think an area that is very ripe for further work. So I'm running close to my time. So I think what we need to think about now is how to build models that not only incorporate the technical capabilities that we care about, but also are able to drive decisions at leadership levels. So I'll give you one very short piece of a snippet from some other like empirical work that I did, where we attempted to understand how decision-making is made at an organizational level in order to try and build better models. And this was the exact details of the privacy technology we studied aren't relevant here, but it was the exam surveillance software that's used in many universities to stop students from cheating. So install it on your computer and it monitors what you do. The interesting part here is how did the leaders who actually decided whether to procure this technology make their decision? What kinds of things were on their mind? Were they thinking formally about privacy anyway? How did that decision go? And if so, where is an opportunity to put in place models that actually improve that kind of decision making? So the model that you might have in your head is the leaders of the organization procure the product, and once they've procured the product, the people at the end actually go and use this. This model, in reality, was far too simplified. Expanding our abstraction out one more layer from our interviews, we found that university governance was generally much more tied into what regulators, accreditors, and compliance officers wanted. And so the way that they were thinking about privacy was shaped by those other organizations and those other entities, which leads us to think a little, okay, how can we start to incorporate other entity types within our formal models of privacy, such that when these people have to make decisions at that level over here, they are more able to start to weigh off the kinds of trade-offs and the types of risks that they might be facing from all the different entities involved. So my second idea that I want to give you as a takeaway before I finish up is that current models of privacy tend to be very unidimensional. Even differential privacy, where you get a nice number out the other end of like how much leakage you have, where you can bound your leakage, you still get kind of one number at the end. But the way that leaders are thinking about this is they're thinking about it in terms of trade-offs between different tensions. And so perhaps there's an opportunity to build formal models which are perhaps more of a vector of numbers rather than just a single epsilon output and then translating that into some way to be useful. So there is a big mismatch between the kinds of formal ways that we're thinking about privacy and the decision-making realities. I will skip that because I'm almost out of time. So my big takeaways is that cryptography is moving away from like the Alice and Bob two-party communication model to try and think about how to build more interesting properties. It's time for privacy to do a bit of a better job of the same. We should do a better job of decomposing actors and incentives. That will give us more insight into the way institutions actually make decisions. And then we have to start as well moving away from this kind of unidimensional focus and the trade-off between privacy and utility, and think about it more the way that organizations think about it. And with that, my takeaways are all a little bit vague and hand-wavy. I haven't actually given you instructions on how to build this formal model that solves all these problems, but thankfully I'm the first speaker, so that's up to the last speaker to try and give you the new formal model. So we need to either better operationalize these kinds of things that we've learned about the world into our privacy models, or we need to do a better job of justifying why our current approach is actually the appropriate one to solve organizational problems. And with that, thank you very much, and I'll take a question or two. Is that what you want to do?
So you started by saying that the research that people produce is not what policymakers need, and I guess in your guess, like what fraction of that is that sort of the ultimate beliefs about what should happen are well aligned between policymakers and scientists, and the work is not providing the right tools to make that case? And to what extent is that because policymakers have an agenda and they want the papers to say what they want, and sometimes the science doesn't say that?
So a lot of the policymakers with whom one will interact, if you're not thinking about like, I'm speaking to my senator, they're actually a lot more technocratic. So you think about people at the FTC who are doing a lot more of privacy regulation, and the DOJ is doing a little bit as well, at least in the US, or the various data protection authorities. They actually do care about the same issues. They have certain political imperatives they need to fill, but I don't think that that's currently the thing that's driving the biggest gap. It tends to be that the papers are getting something wrong about the way the world works. At least that's been this isn't I can't write this in a research paper quite the same way because this is more informal conversations that I've had with the people, but they say, look, this research paper misunderstood how the law worked or their definition doesn't fit adequately. And as a result, we can't use this research to justify what we do. And even relying on the empirics, when we cite that paper, it's going to create some tension for us because other people pick up that they've got something fundamentally wrong about the way this works. There is something that I've noticed in a lot of papers as well, that they'll have recommendation sections which are very singularly focused. So they'll say, in order to solve this privacy problem, regulators should do blah. And very often they don't consider trade-offs in that section. Not that there's room in a paper to consider the full economic and policy trade-offs of something you want to do, but there's not even that level of nuance that hints at the fact that, you know, for most policy decisions, there is some kind of cost to whatever you choose to do, or some kind of flip side. So what is the cost of implementing stronger privacy protections in this place? And what is the argument that we can actually make for the fact that that cost is worthwhile? And that's something I think that we do very poorly as a community.
See the rest of the questions.